So welcome everyone and thank you for coming to this snapshot. As Scott said, my name is Sasha Riley-Smith and I work at Traffic based in Cambridge as a data and information support to the Combating Wildlife Crime in Namibia Vango Zambezi Area Project, or CWCP for short. And I'm a co-author on the report I will be discussing. And I apologise if I don't sound entirely healthy. I'm just getting over some COVID, so I may cough during this presentation. So under the Combating Wildlife Crime Project, Traffic interviewed 45 wildlife crime offenders from 13 correctional facilities across Namibia, which at the time represented over half of all offenders in prison for wildlife crimes. And the aim of our interviews was to establish the motivations for getting involved, demographics, and modus operandi of the crimes. So I'll go straight into demographics. So we found that all of the people we interviewed were male, and most were in their 20s or 30s. 60% had some level of school education, while one even obtained a degree. And a number of nationalities were represented, unsurprisingly, a large number of Namibians, but also Angolans, Zambians, Zimbabweans, and Chinese, reflecting the international nature of wildlife crimes. Most offenders were employed in some capacity at the time of arrest, but it seems that although offenders were financially motivated, unemployment was not a prerequisite for getting involved. Rather, the reliability and the financial rewards of any employment was more important. And the majority of the offenders had children, some even had 10, and they saw wildlife crime as a way to supplement their income for themselves or for their families. So when talking to the offenders about how they carried out the crime, we found that they took on a number of roles within the supply chain. For example, an individual may have poached an animal, harvested the product, and then transported it to a point of sale, therefore fulfilling 3 different roles in that example. 35 offenders travelled to collect or deliver wildlife products within Namibia, making domestic travel or domestic transport the role most frequently fulfilled by the offenders. And other roles included harvesting from an existing carcass, hunting, facilitation, and travelling across international borders with products. And the offenders rarely described a concerted effort to conceal the products from law enforcement. For example, items were found stored in a bag in the boot of a car, which is how most of us move things around. We did have 2 occasions of products being purposely hidden within or under the spare wheel of the vehicle. And in terms of poaching, 11 admitted to poaching an animal themselves, and 9 knew who had done it if it wasn't them. And the offenders that did poach described using dogs, firearms, spears, and hunting at night. So firearms were more likely to be used against megafauna, such as elephant and rhino. And then axes or knives were used to remove products from a carcass, such as horns or tusks. And actually 5 offenders didn't use any equipment. So they caught a live pangolin or dug up buried tusks. And then spears and dogs were used against smaller animals such as zebra, oryx, and pangolin. So the offenders that we spoke to were convicted for unlawful hunting, trade, and or possession of 8 different species across 31 cases. And in talking to them, we were very surprised by the lack of knowledge regarding where or why a product was in demand and its value. So on this table, if we look at the first row relating to elephants, we can see that some offenders suggested there was a demand for ivory in China, which I think most of us would acknowledge. However, other nationalities were also proposed, including Namibians and Congolese. And then it was also suggested that the meat and the trunk of elephants were commodities in demand. And then what's interesting is you look at the last column on this table is we can see that actually only 3 out of 18 offenders who were involved in elephant crimes put forward these suggestions, meaning that most actually didn't know why the products they had in their possession were worth trading. And it's a similar scenario for the other high-value products, such as rhino horn, pangolin scales, and leopard skins. And then this leads on nicely as to what was the perceived reward for getting involved. The level of knowledge offenders had regarding product value, so what they expected to sell it for, and the process of how to sell it and to whom was limited. They were all aware that the product had a monetary value, and they knew this because other individuals had sold similar products, but they didn't have a specific price in mind. So they didn't think, okay, I'm going to go into town and find this man and ask for this amount of money. They'd walk into town and say, I'm going to find a man and ask for something. And so this suggests to us that not only are the offenders at the lower levels in the supply chain, but the exploitation by higher levels is occurring. So as I've hopefully shown you, that many of the offenders we spoke to were low-level actors and opportunists trying to improve their livelihood without a clear sense of reward or avenues for onward sale. The poaching methods were unsophisticated and they did not describe any kind of syndicate structure. And we have to acknowledge it's certainly possible that they were simply not telling the truth or omitting certain details during the interviews. However, colleagues in South Africa interviewed syndicate members in prison who did freely talk, so we can only take what the offenders said on face value. And sadly, all the offenders regretted their decision to get involved and felt their families were suffering as a result. So we've seen at a local level that knowledge about a resource is passed from one person or community to another via word of mouth. However, the offenders did not shed light on the next stage of the international supply chain. There's no doubt in my mind that some of the products the offenders were caught with were destined for the international market, but they had no knowledge of the mechanisms. For example, where the items are consolidated, what are the major transport and concealment methods, payment methods, export locations on the continent, and import locations in demand countries. And this is where the organised syndicates come in, who know how to avoid detection by law enforcement or can afford to pay a fine instead of serving prison time. So in touching on the theme of today, understanding organised crime, the illegal wildlife trade is facilitated by serious and organised criminals. But specifically in this Namibian context, we need to bridge the knowledge enforcement gap between the low-level actors that we met and those that coordinate, consolidate and profit significantly from the illegal wildlife trade. So thank you for listening today. And I will put a link to the extended report in the chat, and it is on the resources page on the PaCCS website if you're interested. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.